My name is Roger. I'm from Minnesota, and I came across your YouTube channel at the beginning of this year. I'm a retired forest ranger, having spent the better part of 3 decades working for the U.S. Forest Service Law Enforcement and Investigations Division. Since my retirement, I've had plenty of time on my hands, and over the past few months, I spent a lot of that time listening to various anthologies that you've published. I think it's awesome that you publish the stories of regular folks like me, so with that in mind, I think I have a story that you might be interested in. It seems a little strange that I'm so excited to tell you about this, as it's not exactly the kind of thing most people want to hear. I used to wonder how you get so many people wanting to share their bad memories with you, but after having thought about it for a while, I think I've figured it out. These aren't the kind of things that we can talk about around the dinner table in polite company, and I've never had a single person ask me in the flesh, what was the scariest thing that's ever happened to you? People don't want to know, at least not the kind of people I've ever associated with, but at the same time, these are things that, for whatever reason, we want to share with people, and much like your channel's viewers, I'm pretty apt to lend my ear to a story that's a little darker. And so, without further rambling on, this is the story of one of the truly terrifying moments in my time as a forest ranger. For the vast majority of my career, I was posted in the Voyageurs National Park, up near the Canadian border. Since the park is split in two by a series of lakes, it's popular with fishermen and kayakers. But these lakes are also populated by many small islands, many of which are popular camping spots. People come up to the VNP to get away from the city and get some privacy, and it doesn't get much more private than your own personal island, really, does it? Well, one afternoon I got a call from a chief ranger asking me to do him a little favor. He'd gotten a call from the International Falls Police Department, IF being a small border city about 20 miles to the west, after an officer over there had received a missing persons report. Some lady's husband had gone on a camping trip with an old friend and had failed to return after being due back that morning. My husband was to head over to their regular camping spot on a place called Wolf Island to see if they'd moved on or not. The ranger team at VNP is probably one of the most amphibious in the country, definitely the most waterborne in the region. Half of our job consists of policing the waterways and making sure all fishing and boating is within regulation, so not only do we have ready access to kayaks and motorboats, but we're very comfortable operating them. So when I got the call, I headed to the Ash River Visitor Center, which was where we docked our boats, but then just as I'm prepping the boat to sail over to Wolf Island, I get a second call from the chief. The IFPD had reached out with an update, one I needed to be informed of immediately. According to the chief, this wasn't just a case of 2 fishermen having overslept after too many Miller Lights. The missing man's son had been in touch, and this time, it was to warn law enforcement that not only was his father most likely armed, but had been acting extremely erratically prior to the departing for the camping trip. This is not what I had been hoping to hear when I'd heard that there was an update, but I was more than equipped to deal with the situation. Seeing as I was on the law enforcement side of things, as opposed to working solely at the visitor center, I had pretty much all the same options as your average police officer. But that didn't mean that I wasn't feeling a sense of apprehension regarding what I might run up against. 9 times out of 10, incidents in the park are resolved quickly and peacefully, but as you can probably guess, it's 1 in 10 that keep you up at night. So after prepping the boat, I sailed west for around 20 to 25 minutes until I spotted Wolf Island. After using my binoculars to observe the island from a safe distance, I can make out a slight plume of smoke coming from its eastern side. I could have really done with some kind of bullhorn to call out to the missing camper, but I didn't have the good sense to bring one. So I was forced to bring my boat right up to within about 20 or 30 feet of the shore before calling out using nothing but my lung power. I called out once, and then twice, and after the third call received no response, I decided to make landfall in order to get a visual on the campfire, which presumably had been started by our missing camper. I brought the boat up a little closer, hopped overboard, then waded my way ashore, calling out to our missing camper all the while. I could smell the campfire by that point, along with whatever was cooking on it, so I was doubtless within earshot of whoever had been tending to it. But since no one called back, and since I didn't see anyone as I walked up the beach, I figured whoever had made camp had moved on. Yet as I walked further onto the island in search of the source of the smoke, something caught my eye. For as long as I live, I'll remember this in photographic detail. It runs in my head on its own sometimes, like someone pressed play on a remote control in my brain. I saw something falling out of the corner of my eye, and when I looked, I saw it was a raven, landing to join some of its brothers and sisters. But then I saw what it was landing on. There was a man sitting in a camping chair, not quite upright, but not all the way slouched either, with a big old hole in the upper rear portion of his skull. One of the ravens was pushing its beak into the hole while a few others fought over whatever had leaked onto the ground. The body accounted for one of our missing campers, but I didn't have to wait long to find the second. Lying motionless next to the campfire was what remained of the second missing camper. Someone had made the effort to cut off his legs, I'm guessing after he was deceased, and had worked on cutting them into small sections before placing them onto the fire. What had been smelling on the way in hadn't been the camper's late lunch. It had been a section of the second camper's leg, sizzling away on the dying embers. I guess the guy in the chair hadn't the heart to finish disposing of his camping buddy, and had decided to let nature take its course on both of them. We never did find out why it happened, but we did figure out how. The killer had invited his quote-unquote friend on a camping trip to their regular spot. He hadn't hidden anything from his wife, or anyone else for that matter, which led us to believe that his decision to kill his camping buddy was either a spontaneous one, or that he had planned to simply kill him before taking his own life as a way of avoiding any consequences. He obviously wanted to conceal what he'd done, at least at one point we believe he had. But then, this is where another argument for the spontaneous murder theory comes into play. Personally, I don't believe that he'd taken the time to research just how arduous the disposal of a dead body can be. There was no accelerant at the scene, so I don't think he'd planned to burn his friend's body, and when it became obvious that it was going to take way longer than he'd thought, and that law enforcement might well come looking for him, or his dead friend, before the disposal could be completed, I think he decided to just check out there and then. There was a somber mood among the park staff for a while after that. As far as I knew, nothing like that had ever happened before, and nothing like that happened again for the remainder of my career. As you can probably guess, national parks aren't exactly high crime areas, and at the VNP, the most intense things generally get is catching up to a speeding boating party so you can tell them to slow down. So to have something so terrible happen right under our noses, it had a real strong effect on our mood during the weeks that followed. Sometimes I think about what happened in that guy's head to make him want to murder one of his best friends. Like I said, we didn't hear about any affairs or betrayals or anything else that might cause a man to temporarily go crazy. It's all just one big mystery. And like so many other of life's mysteries, I think I'm a lot more comfortable living in blissful ignorance. My daughter is a very big fan of yours, and as part of her birthday present, she asked me to write up a story that I told her last Thanksgiving regarding my days volunteering with the park service. I promise it's not the only present that she's getting this year, and I'll admit to being very taken aback when she first proposed the idea. But while very unusual, it was impossible to refuse, so here I am at her request. I grew up in St. Louis, then moved down to Knoxville after I enrolled at the University of Tennessee. Then, during the summer between my freshman and sophomore years, I signed up to a seasonal volunteer ranger program at the nearby Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Although my career aspirations involved sitting behind a desk, I'd always thought it would be cool to be a park ranger. Maybe it's the masculine ideal of working outdoors, rescuing wounded animals and becoming one with nature along the way. So, when I heard I could basically play the part of one for a month, while wearing my very own campaign hat, my interest was piqued. I got in touch with the right people, arranged the dates, then spent 7 long months looking forward to it. But when I got there, I found my work to be anything but exhilarating. In essence, the seasonal volunteer program was little more than a way of securing vacation time for the grossly understaffed ranger teams, And what's more, we were never trusted to do anything that required any real experience or expertise. This meant that around 60% of the time, myself and the other 2 volunteers were staffing the park's visitor center. The other 40% of the time, we were only trusted to do things like basic administrative tasks or boundary maintenance. I don't know what I was expecting. National parks have to keep their books in order, just like the rest of us, but I most definitely preferred boundary maintenance over anything that involved being cooped up indoors. Boundary maintenance was a very fancy name the Forest Service gave to fence checking, and as you can probably guess, all that involves walking long sections of boundary fence to make sure they're in a decent state of repair. Walking those boundary fences was probably the closest I got to living my ideal ranger lifestyle, but it was also one of those hikes that I came across someone I still think about, often, even after all these years later. I was out near a place called Cosby Creek, which is on the eastern boundary of the park. This area is of particular importance during the boundary checks, as there's an old graveyard named Tritt Cemetery out that way, so we obviously don't want the wildlife digging up old bones or otherwise desecrating the place in some way. I made sure all the fences on the cemetery were intact and then continued eastward along the fence line for maybe 10 to 15 minutes, when suddenly I saw someone moving through the trees up ahead of me. The second I laid my eyes on them, I had this moment of bizarre doubt where I thought there was no possible way that what I was seeing was real. I'm not a doctor, so I couldn't tell you how much blood a person can lose and still be functioning, but my God, the girl who softly sobbed as she walked barefoot through the trees must have been running on fumes. She was completely without clothes and with big patches of her skin missing, revealing all this clotted blood and dried gore underneath. Almost every part of her, from her hair down to her toes, was covered in blood, and I was stunned that she was even on her feet. I immediately rushed into action, rushing over to her as she collapsed into the dirt. I took off my shirt, used it to cover her up as best I could, then picked her up and carried her back to my truck. I guess it was a stroke of good fortune that I found her so close to where I'd parked, but I was still fit to collapse by the time we got there. I knew there was an urgent care up in Newport, which is around 12 miles or so north of Cosby, so I drove as fast as I possibly could after loading the girl into the backseat of my truck. I don't think I said anything to her aside from, "Don't close your eyes, you gotta stay awake." She kept her eyes wide open the whole way, but she never made a sound either. She just lay there, curled up into a ball with my shirt over her, staring at nothing until we finally made it to the urgent care center. I know they're not necessarily equipped to deal with emergencies like that, but I didn't know where else to take her. So after administering some initial treatment, I was told the girl would be taken over to Sevierville, where there was a general hospital equipped with a dedicated emergency room. And that's where my role in the whole thing ended. I asked if I could be of any more help, but was told that the best thing I could do was go back and tell the chief ranger what had happened. This was way back before cell phones, and I could have used the hospital's payphone to let the team know where I was, but by that time, I figured it was better to just drive back, change out of my bloody clothes, and tell everyone what had happened face to face. When I walked into Ranger HQ and the chief and my coworkers saw the blood on my clothes, they knew something terrible had happened. They thought it was me that was hurt at first, and I had to tell them something I've only heard said in movies before. "It's not my blood," I told them, and then I launched into the explanation where I'd been and what had happened. The chief took notes the whole time. Seeing as we had full jurisdiction, the only other group that could legally push us out of the way would be the FBI or something. Unless we called in their help or they stepped in without us asking, it would be up to us to investigate what had happened to the girl. And that's where things got really weird. Obviously, we needed to talk to the girl that I'd found in order to establish what had happened to her. But when the chief contacted the hospital and spoke to the relevant doctors, we found out that she hadn't said a word. Not just about what had happened to her either. She wouldn't say a word to anyone. This didn't strike any of us as particularly unusual. The poor girl had no doubt gone through an extremely traumatic event, meaning she most likely wouldn't want to talk about it until she'd sufficiently calmed down. The doctors told us to check back the next day, but also that they'd be in touch if there were any changes. So, that's what we did. We waited until the early afternoon of the following day, then called the hospital again to see if the girl had started talking. She hadn't. She wouldn't talk to doctors, wouldn't talk to nurses. And we sure as hell could try, but the doctors didn't think that she talked to us either. The chief handled all the calls, but seeing as I was the one who found her, he asked me to join him on the ride to the hospital in hopes that seeing me again might push her to talk. I got the word on my radio, and when I did, I stopped what I was doing, resource management so it wasn't all that urgent, and then drove back to HQ to join the chief at his truck. We talked about how the investigation might unfold on the drive over to the hospital, completely unaware of the fact that there wasn't going to be any kind of investigation at all. Because when we got to the hospital and went looking for our nameless victim, we found the nursing staff in a minor panic. It took us a while to work out what was going on, but when we did, shocked doesn't even begin to cover it. The hospital had lost our victim. A review of their security cameras showed a man dressed in hospital scrubs, pushing a wheelchair through the hospital's main entrance just after 1:15 p.m. He wore some kind of ID clipped to his chest, somehow talked his way past reception, and then headed straight for the room where our victim was kept. There he loaded her up onto the wheelchair, then simply pushed her out of the hospital without any attempt to stop him whatsoever. Obviously, it was a huge breach of the hospital's standard of practice, but without any idea who our victim or her apparent abductor was, we had almost no means of recourse, except one. Seeing as we had a potential abduction on our hands, we actually did call in the help of the FBI. Obviously, our main concern was that whoever had taken the girl out of the hospital was the same person, or at least part of the same group of people that had put her in the hospital in the first place. We didn't have the resources to go chasing after the guy, but the FBI did, so after we officially transferred the investigation over to them, it was pretty much out of our hands. We hoped that that meant the investigation might actually progress, but about a month later, when our chief checked back with the FBI contact, we learned that the case just wasn't a priority for them. We had expected to be contacted regarding the formation of a joint task force, which is standard practice whenever the FBI coordinates with local law enforcement. But after a review of the evidence, some desk jockey somewhere had decided the case wasn't worth pursuing. They weren't keen on allocating resources to a case where, potentially, the only charges would be impersonating a healthcare professional. I'm not a lawyer, so I couldn't tell you the kinds of punishments a crime like that might get you, but I know it wouldn't be nearly as much as assault or kidnapping, neither of which had any real evidence for. If the girl had talked, if she said anything that was pertinent to the case, we might have something to work with, but we didn't. All we had were theories and assumptions, none of which were comparable to hard evidence. And so, that's where the story ended. If the girl came forward to make a criminal complaint, then our case was back on. But until then, or until our mysterious fake nurse committed another crime someplace, then we were all out of options, and it was better to just let it go. I'm not saying I was okay with that. If it were up to me, I'd have chased that case to the ends of the earth to find out what the hell happened to that poor girl. But it wasn't up to me. I wasn't even a real ranger at the time, and when my time was up, I went back to summer vacation, then back to my studies come fall time. But that doesn't mean I forgot. I've never forgotten what that girl looked like, or how it felt to see her limping through the trees, hearing that awful, exhausted sobbing sound that she was making. And when I felt like the time was right, I decided to share this story with my daughter. I know that might seem strange to you and your listeners, telling my teenage daughter something so frightening and strange, but I feel like there's a lesson in there that I needed to teach her. When driving back to HQ after dropping the girl off at the urgent care, I was under the impression that the ranger team, along with whatever other law enforcement agencies got involved, would fight to bring her attackers to justice. I don't know if I mentioned it already, but at one point, the idea was floated that the girl had been in some kind of accident. Maybe falling down a rocky hillside had torn her clothes off, someone suggested. But all of them? Every scrap of clothing just so happened to be torn to shreds, but somehow she wasn't killed on the way down. I don't buy that, not for a second. She had to have been attacked by someone or something. Now that's obviously a very frightening thought, but whether we like it or not, monsters are always going to exist, and they'll exist as they've always done in a variety of different forms. You can always expect bad things to happen in life, but what you don't expect is seeing the very people that you thought were charged with your very protection acting like they just don't care if you lived or died. There might have been a time in this country where justice was a man with a fast horse, a shiny badge, a well-oiled pistol, and a warm heart. But nowadays, justice sits behind a desk. Justice wears a suit and a tie, and justice has a budget. And whatever heart it once had has grown cold, callous, and uncaring. The story I'm about to tell you is strange all on its own, but to understand why it continues to haunt me long after it occurred, I have to fill you in on a little background information. I tied the knot with my now ex-husband in 1987. We were madly in love with one another and had every intention of staying together until we were old and gray. But the truth was, we wouldn't last 5 years. We had trouble getting pregnant, so we went to a fertility doctor to do some tests, and that is how I found out that I was incapable of bearing children. It didn't seem like the end of the world, not at first anyway, and discussed both the possibilities of adoption as well as living a child-free lifestyle. I thought our marriage was strong enough to survive something like that, and it turns out that I was wrong. When he filed for divorce, I was heartbroken, and I never really experienced true heartbreak until then. If he'd have said from the get-go, "Look, babe, I can't be with someone who can't have my kids," then at least I'd have more time for it to sink in and for me to get over it. But it was how he raised up my hopes before dashing them that's what hurt more than anything else. I couldn't bear to be around him after that. He wanted to be an amicable split, but I just didn't have it in me to remain friends with him. I guess that must make me seem pretty immature to some people, but I just wasn't emotionally equipped to deal with something like that. I left town, moved back in with my parents for a few months, then set about deciding what I wanted to do with my life. It might sound silly, but I'd half expected my role in life to be a mother and homemaker. I know that isn't exactly shooting for the stars to some, but it was all I ever really wanted. I wanted a simple life, a happy life, and it took me an embarrassingly long amount of time to realize that I could be happy being something other than a housewife. During that time, when I was finally able to go outside without bursting into tears at the first sight of a mother and child, I spent a lot of time hiking woodland trails. The peace and seclusion helped me put my mind back together again, but the more I did, the more I realized something about myself. I could quite happily spend the rest of my working days walking around the woods in relative peace and quiet. Then, when I mentioned that to my dad, he very casually suggested something that changed my life forever. "Why don't you apply to the Forest Service?" he asked one day, and I remember trying to think of a reason why that wasn't possible. I couldn't picture myself being a ranger, but back then, I could hardly picture myself doing anything at all except crying myself to sleep every night after hours upon hours of just terrible television. But then the more I thought about it, the more I realized that there were no reasons I couldn't be a park ranger. Since I didn't have a bachelor's degree, I'd have to intern for a full 2 years before being offered a full-time position, but that didn't bother me. I sure didn't have anything else going on for me at the time, so I decided to just go for it. Now, having grown up in Garrett County, Maryland, I sometimes pictured myself walking the Appalachian Trail during the warm summer months, wearing one of those Smokey Bear hats. But when it came time to applying for internships, there was only one place accepting applicants, and that was Acadia National Park up in Maine. I'd never pictured myself living that far north, and I wondered how I was going to survive the winters up there. But it also offered a new start in a new place, far from the painful memories I wanted so much to leave behind. And so, in the late summer of 1992, I packed up my things and moved up to the small hamlet of Seal Harbor. I moved into a small rental house on a street called, and this is not a joke, Whoville Way. I never did figure out if it was some sort of nod to Dr. Seuss or not. None of my neighbors had a definitive answer, but it was nice, a quiet place to live, and it made getting to and from the park every day much easier. I interned for 2 years, completed all the necessary training. Then by the fall of 1994, I was a fully fledged member of the Acadia Ranger team, badge and all. There was a presentation ceremony, which my mom and dad traveled up for especially, and I experienced feelings of pride and self-belief that at one point I'd never have thought possible. I considered it a huge achievement, and there's no denying how happy it made me, but I still felt this sort of baby-sized hole in my life, one I knew that I'd never be able to fill. Now cut to about a year later, to June of 1995, and I was completing a land inspection near a rocky hill named Connor's Nubble. Once I was done, I turned around and started walking the 2 miles back to Park HQ, but as I got closer to the shores of Eagles Lake, I decided to take a shortcut between 2 trails to save me some time. It wasn't a well-walked-out section of trail, and I'd never made the shortcut before, but I knew the park well enough to know that if I worked my way through the undergrowth, I'd come out on the opposite trail and have a much easier hike back to HQ. So that's what I did. I turned off the trail and was walking through the trees when, suddenly, something caught my foot. I didn't see the thing at all, meaning I was so caught off guard that the stumble almost sent me crashing into the dirt. So after calling whatever it was a mother lover, I decided to kick away some shrubs to see exactly what had almost taken me out. I figured it'd be a rock of some description, and if it was possible to do so, I planned on digging it up and tossing it to one side to ensure that no one would be tripping over it again. Some might call this a little extreme, but it becomes second nature to make the park as safe a place as possible for visitors and coworkers alike. One thing you learn as a forest ranger is that a lot of things are completely out of your control, which then teaches you to always act on the stuff you can control. Anyway, after stamping my foot down to find the thing that had tripped me, and then kicking away the shrubs around it, I was surprised by what I saw. It couldn't have been a rock. The shape was way too unnatural, and after wiping away some of the soil around it, I caught a glimpse of something that looked a lot like a seam. And if it had a seam, then it might just be some kind of box that someone had buried there sometime in the recent or distant past. But no matter what it was, I didn't have the time nor the energy to stop what I was doing and dig it up. So instead, I tried to mark out the spot as best I could, stamping down more of the undergrowth to make the clearing more visible, then made my way back to the HQ. I mentioned the thing in passing to one of my coworkers, and although she wasn't exactly shocked, she did show some interest. I know for a lot of you, the first thing that comes to mind is some kind of buried treasure, and with Northeast Harbor boasting some summer residents such as the Rockefellers no less, it wasn't out of the question that something valuable had been buried there. But even so, no one was rushing to go dig it up. I mean, I didn't even really know what it was. So while the box remained of interest, digging it up wasn't a priority by any stretch of the imagination. A few days went by. Then one afternoon I found myself with a few spare hours. But then, rather than finish early for the day, I decided to grab a shovel, head down to the shortcut near Eagle Lake, and dig up the box to find out exactly what it was. It made for hard and sweaty work, but after maybe an hour or so of digging, I was finally able to see that, yes, it was a box, no bigger than the kind that you'd buy shoes in, and it looked like it had been buried there for a long time. I heaved it from the dirt, dusted it off, then set about pulling away the rotten twine from the latch where a padlock might have otherwise been. I'll admit to being quite excited at the time, and it didn't once occur to me that it could have been anything sinister. But when I opened the box and lifted up a rotten piece of cloth away from whatever was inside, I gasped and slammed the lid shut after catching just a glimpse. It wasn't gold or silver or jewels, nor was it a murder weapon from some decades-old murder, as one ranger had suggested with a chuckle. It was a skeleton. the tiny, newly formed skeleton of a departed newborn baby. I didn't touch anything else. I just ran back to HQ to tell people what I'd found. Soon, almost everyone on duty that day was down near Eagle Lake. Then, not long after, so were several other state troopers and a whole forensics team. But before they all got there and taped the scene off, our chief ranger looked inside the box just to see for himself what was in there. Like I said, I only got a glimpse, but I saw enough to know what I was looking at, whereas the chief, he took a long, hard look at that poor little thing, long enough to see the things I hadn't. I couldn't bring myself to look at it again for a long time, but when the chief said the skeleton looked all wrong, he was right. I hadn't ever seen a baby skeleton before, so it wasn't like I was an expert. But all who said it agreed that the skull seemed way too large, and that the arms seemed way too long. As one of us put it, the poor little thing barely looked human, but it was because the genetic testing came back positive as being entirely human in origin. In the end, we pieced together a very sad chain of events. Sometime between 1920 and 1930, some unsuspecting mother gave birth to a heartbreaking, disabled child. There was a chance that this child died of natural causes because there were no signs of any trauma on the skeleton, but that didn't rule out the possibility that someone had taken it upon themselves to personally end the child's suffering. Then, after the child was gone, someone placed it in what would have been at the time an expensive felt-lined box, then buried it deep in the woods where no one might ever find it. Why they might opt to do that in lieu of just giving the child a proper funeral, I have no idea, but the reason couldn't have been a good one. Cut to almost 80 years later, and some slowly growing tree root has pushed it further and further to the surface over time, until just a nub is sticking above ground. A little nub that I just so happened to have stumbled over. Seeing as the child's body was found on federal property, we were able to enlist the help of the FBI's DNA analysis unit down in Quantico, like I think I already mentioned, and we were hoping that we might get a match on a distant relative that had a file, but nothing came back positive. This little kid had no name, no date of birth, and its only possession was the small improvised coffin we found it in. We also heard from the FBI that the child's large skull, which they called macrocephaly, was probably the result of a genetic disorder such as Weaver's or Soto's syndrome. From what I can understand, conditions like those are relatively easy to treat today, but back then, some poor kid born in bad circumstances, they wouldn't have nearly the same chances. It all makes for a heartbreaking story. Even our most probable theories were nothing but speculation, but no matter which way you can cut it, whatever happened to that child had been simply awful. And that's not why the whole thing has haunted me for all these years, not the story on its own anyways. Instead, it's been this. Sometimes in my darkest of moments I feel like that poor baby was my own. I feel like it was a strange kind of destiny that brought me to that shortcut and had me stumbling over its makeshift coffin. I know that probably sounds like I'm losing my mind, and it's definitely not an idea I've ever discussed out loud really with anyone, but it really is the way I feel sometimes. I'm not able to have children, but what I was given was the chance to bring peace, in the form of a proper burial, to a child whose real parents were unwilling or unable to give them one. And in doing so, I think I've been able to get just a taste of how boundless and unconditional a mother's love can be, and for that, I'll always be grateful. So I was listening to your other park ranger stories, and I wanted to send mine in too. I hope you don't mind if I send this to a few of my other favorite channels as well, and hopefully that means you'll get to mine first. I'm medically retired from the United States Forest Service, but I was a ranger at Kniksu National Park for 7 years between 1985 and 1992. Kniksu is up in the Idaho Panhandle, less than 50 miles from the Canadian border. Think forests, mountains, and lakes in the summer, then a carpet of snow and ice in the wintertime, with the Kootenai River to the north and Lake Penn, Oriel to the south. Everything else is a lot of ridges and valleys, and on the last day on the job, I was walking through one of those very same valleys. I was performing my regular duties, minding my own business, when suddenly I experienced what felt like prime Mike Tyson punching me on the right side of my hip. It spun me, but the force of it also took my legs out from under me, and as I fell, I heard the crack of a rifle coming from up the valley somewhere. My first thought was that it was an accident. It might seem crazy, but you'd be surprised the kind of mistakes hunters make when they're itching for that first bag of the season. It's why we have so many regulations in the first place. I couldn't see the shooter, so I started to call out, "Don't shoot, I'm a ranger!" One hand putting pressure on the bullet wound at my hip, and the other waving wildly back and forth as if to say no, 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 no. I expected someone to emerge from behind the tree or to stand up and reveal themselves before running down the valley in horror, but instead, the shooter fired at me again. I don't know how they didn't hit me. I was sat right there on the forest floor, but when I saw the dirt explode just inches in front of me, I instinctively rolled behind the only cover I had, which was a rotting log barely long enough to cover my whole body. Believe it or not, I still couldn't believe whoever was out there was deliberately shooting at me. I just couldn't imagine why someone would want to do that. Who in their right minds would be willing to open fire on a forest ranger? I tried calling out again. "I'm friendly! Stop shooting!" A few times, and the shooter responded by putting a bullet into the log I was hiding behind. Somehow, it didn't penetrate, but depending on how much ammunition they had, they could just blow the log apart, then blow me apart once they had a clear line of sight. Only then did it really sink in what was happening, and only then did the solution become obvious. Before rolling onto my front, I made sure my legs were still working enough to run, then began to sort of aim my body in the direction I'd parked my truck. The shooter didn't fire, and that seemed to scare me even more. He was just watching, waiting for me to make a move. If I stuck my head up and they were still there, waiting to take a shot, I was dead. I had to do something to make them flinch enough to at least miss if they took a shot, and since all I had at my disposal was my sidearm, that's what I used. I fired off a few rounds over the log after rolling onto my side, then got up and sprinted off through the trees, firing wildly behind me as I ran. I know the shooter took one last shot at me. I heard the crack as the bullet flew just over my head, but I was somehow able to run far and fast enough to break his line of sight and make it back to my truck alive. Since Ranger HQ was way down in Coeur d'Alene, I drove to the emergency room in Sandpoint instead. It's a long story, but I was only able to notify one other ranger regarding my injuries, and it was she that relayed the information back to Ranger HQ while I drove over to Sandpoint. My biggest fear was passing out at the wheel due to blood loss, but as a doctor later told me, I've gotten extremely lucky regarding where the bullet had struck me, as well as the path that it took through my hip. Any further to the left, and I probably wouldn't have been able to run, and any further down, and it risked severing my femoral artery. If that had happened, I wouldn't even made it to my truck, let alone the hospital. With the park being federal land, the FBI actually joined in our ranger team in scouring the park for a potential shooter, but by the time they got there, the person who tried to kill me was long gone. The Bureau took the matter very seriously and interviewed me extensively, mostly as I recovered from surgery in my hospital bed. They had dogs running all over the park for weeks looking for boot prints, bullet casings, you name it, but they didn't find a thing. The best that they could do was tell me the kind of rifle that had been used to shoot at me, which was a Remington Model 700. But during the final interview, one agent shared one of their prevailing theories with me. They couldn't rule out that my attacker was some kind of crazed hunter who suffered a psychotic episode and took a few shots at me. But that being said, there was one angle the task force was particularly interested in working. Just a few months before I was shot, a team of U.S. Marshals approached a cabin over in Boundary County. They had an arrest warrant for a guy named Randy Weaver, but during their approach they ended up shooting the guy's dog, and then his son. One of Weaver's friends then opened fire on the Marshals, kicking off an 11-day standoff in which a police sniper shot Weaver's wife. This guy was wanted on firearms charges, so the marshals thought that he had a whole arsenal of machine guns stashed away in his cabin, and that's why they went in like it was a war zone, and how they ended up killing 2 innocent people. Randy Weaver ended up getting millions in compensation from the government, but before that, the whole situation created a media firestorm and pissed off a lot of very violent people. And that's where the FBI agent I talked to figured it tied into my case. It was just speculation, but he and some of his fellow agents believed that since I was a representative of the federal government, some wacko with a hunting rifle figured I was a legitimate revenge target for what came to be known as Ruby Ridge. A few years later, that psycho who blew up the federal building in Oklahoma City said Ruby Ridge was the thing that drove him nuts. And those are my words, by the way, not his. The FBI never caught the guy who shot me, and as far as I know, they're still out there, proud at having hit back at the Fed or whatever crazy bullcrap they've brainwashed themselves with. And who knows, maybe they regret it. Maybe they'd apologize if they knew they could get away with it. But I can't say it's one I'd ever accept. Not until I can afford that second round of hip surgery, anyway. The Picos de Europa National Park is a mountainous nature reserve in the northern Spanish region of Cantabria. The park attracts around 3 million visitors a year who come seeking its verdant forests, crystal-clear lakes, and majestic snow-capped mountains. However, each of these visitors is issued a stark warning, as the Picos de Europa are known to be every bit as brutal as they are beautiful. During the winter months, freak snowstorms can send temperatures plummeting into the mid-30s, resulting in an extensive list of fatalities and missing persons. The park is also home to Cantabrian brown bears, whose population exploded following a ban on the hunting of the species in the early 70s. The bears aren't known for their aggression towards humans, but along with the wolves and wild boars the park is also home to, they can prove a deadly threat to those caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Yet Cantabria isn't just famous for its wild, natural beauty. It's also the place where a decades-long mystery was finally brought to a close. But like so many other similar instances, the revelation raised many more questions than it answered. Back in 1945, 31-year-old Eloy Campillo Perez was employed as a forest ranger at the Picos de Europa National Park. He also happened to be the elected mayor of the small nearby town of Sotres, which is nationally renowned for its queso de cambrales, a kind of blue cheese which is matured in the many limestone caves present in the surrounding mountains. But Eloy's life was anything but peaceful or happy. Between 1936 and 1939, Spain had been scorched by the fires of civil war, and by its end, fascist dictator General Franco had declared himself the victor and ruler of all of Spain. With the surrender of anti-fascist forces in the face of a unified far right, the Civil War may have officially come to a close, but for much of Spain's Republican resistance, the fight was far from over. They took refuge in the last of the country's wilderness areas, melting into the forests and mountains whenever pursued by Franco's forces, and the region of Picos de Europa was no different. Many of the resistance fighters who sheltered in the park were known to Eloy all his life. Some he'd shared a classroom with during his formative years, others were blood relatives, meaning there's no doubt that Eloy had a degree of sympathy for them. However, given he was mayor of Sotres, Eloy had certain obligations to his fascist overlords. Essentially, he was stuck between a rock and a hard place. He could betray his country, or betray his friends, both of which would result in his death. So instead, it seems Eloy attempted to remain as neutral as possible. He paid just enough lip service to the regime to avoid falling under suspicion, while remaining tight-lipped regarding the location of anti-fascist guerrillas in the Picos de Europa. All that mattered to him was keeping the people of Sotres safe. One of fascist Spain's primary sponsors had been Germany, but following the Red Army's rush of Berlin and the collapse of Germany's narcocratic nightmare, the future of Spanish fascism was brought into doubt. With his stranglehold on Eastern Europe assured, Joseph Stalin declared that global revolution would continue indefinitely, fanning the hopes of Marxist insurgents around the world. The guerrillas of Picos de Europa were no different, and following the German surrender, began immediately stepping up the intensity of their operations. They ambushed units of the Spanish Civil Guard with ever-increasing frequency, and even went so far as to seek out ways of producing explosive material. This was an extremely risky move, and in trying to involve the people of Sotres in their pursuit of volatile chemicals, the guerrillas risked bringing the full force of fascist retribution down on the small mountain town. This was something that Eloy could not tolerate, and in mid-April of 1945, he sought out a parley with an old friend. 27-year-old Juan Fernandez Ayala was an old companion of Eloy's and had joined up with the Republicans at the outbreak of hostilities some 9 years before. Over the next decade, Juan rose through the ranks, receiving multiple battlefield promotions until he found himself second in command of all regional resistance forces. It was under Juan's deputy leadership that Cantabria saw a sharp uptick in political violence, so in an attempt to avert a wider conflict, Eloy reached out to his old friend to arrange a meeting. Then on Sunday, April 15th of 1945, Eloy walked deep into the Pico de Europa wilderness, far from any road or tract, to an old abandoned villa being slowly reclaimed by nature. There, Juan and a cadre of his guerrillas were waiting, and after some brief introductions, Eloy began to make his appeal. Franco's overthrow could not come quick enough, he explained, but an escalation of violence risked destroying the very place they called home. Juan and his comrades listened as Eloy made his case, until suddenly they heard footsteps coming from outside. 2 days before the meeting was due to take place, Eloy had confided in a fellow park ranger that he was due to meet with the guerrillas. It's clear that Eloy trusted the man enough to share such sensitive information with him, so there's no doubt to believe that he was a government informant. But at the same time, there's no doubt that he would have been terrified that he too might be implicated in the plot, because the night before the meeting, Eloy's fellow park ranger betrayed him to the Spanish Civil Guard. The footsteps Juan and Eloy heard that afternoon didn't belong to more of the former's anti-fascist comrades, nor did they belong to some innocent hikers who just so happened to have stumbled upon the place. They belonged to a heavily armed troop of Spanish Civil Guard, all of whom were intent on slaughtering those present at the meeting. Yet the guerrillas weren't stupid. There was a reason they'd survived for 6 long years up in the forests and mountains, and when they chose the abandoned villa as their meeting place, they did so because of how easily defendable it was. This meant that when they realized that they'd been discovered by their sworn enemies, they weren't only capable of mounting a defense, they were practically spoiling for a fight. Despite being aware of their location, the guerrillas were able to rush into position and execute an almost perfect ambush on the approaching civil guard. 2 of the fascists were immediately dispatched, and the remaining civil guard were pinned down, picked off, and then forced into a retreat until reinforcements could arrive. The guerrillas used this lull in the fighting to flee the area, but before they did so, they fell upon the bodies of the dead and dying fascists, looting everything they possibly could before making their escape. Eloy ran all the way back to Sotres, where the victorious guerrillas melted back into the mountains, vanishing among a network of hidden encampments. Over the days that followed, Eloy waited anxiously for that fateful knock on his front door. The Spanish government had an extensive network of civilian informants, and seemed only a matter of time before someone would come for him. But when the knock came, and Eloy opened his front door, he discovered it was Juan on the doorstep. "Come with me," his old friend said. "We need to talk." In the aftermath of the firefight at the abandoned villa, the anti-fascist guerrillas carried away a great deal of loot from the slain civil guardsmen. Apparently, one of the fallen guardsmen was an officer, because among that loot was a small, folded piece of paper with the group's orders written on it. The note named Eloy's fellow park ranger, Alfonso Martinez, as their informant, and it's possible that it mentioned that another unnamed park ranger being the primary source of the information. It's reasonable to believe that in order to preserve the anonymity of a man he was no doubt close to, Alfonso Martinez neglected to name Eloy in his report to the Spanish police. But seeing as the Pico de Europa's ranger team was so small in number, the guerrillas quickly deduced that the primary source was none other than Eloy Campillo Perez. On April 24th of 1945, Eloy was marched up into the mountains to a top-secret guerrilla headquarters and subjected to several rounds of intense interrogation. What happened afterwards is a subject of much speculation, even today. But a few months later, one captured guerrilla fighter claimed to know the definitive truth. Referring to Juan Fernandez Ayala by his nickname Juanan, the captured guerrilla explained that he'd spotted Juan walking Eloy into the jungle. The pair had seemed relaxed, with Juan assuring his old friend that everything was going to be okay, and that he'd been forgiven for his accidental transgression. Moments later, a single gunshot was heard, and Juan returned alone. After learning of his death, Eloy's relatives contacted the Spanish police and pleaded with them to bring home his body. Joined by dozens of civilian volunteers, officers conducted extensive searches of the Picos de Europas, but no trace of Eloy could be found. It was hoped that one day, Juan Fernandez Ayala might reveal the location of Eloy's body, but it was a secret that he would take to his grave. On April 24th of 1957, 12 years to the day since Eloy's execution, Juan was killed in a shootout with Spanish military police. In the end, Eloy's loved ones grew to accept that, dead or alive, he was never coming home. But in the words of Walt Whitman, nothing is ever really lost. During the summer of 2018, a team of professional cavers was exploring a system of underground passageways on the eastern side of the Picos de Europa. Thanks in part to funding from the European Union, the Spanish government hired the group of highly experienced spelunkers to search for the remains of those who had gone missing as a result of both the Spanish Civil War as well as its prolonged and painful aftermath. Eloy Campillo Perez wasn't the only man to go missing in the area, so it's not like the search team was specifically looking for him. But there's no doubt that reports of his disappearance factored into the government's decision to dispatch cavers to the national park. Upon reaching the entrance of a subterranean cave known as the Torca de Topanoria, the group unpacked their things and prepared to descend almost 200 meters beneath the earth. The climb down took a great deal of care and precision, no small feat even for such experienced cavers, but once they successfully reached the bottom of the cavers began a careful search for any trace of human remains. They soon found some. Among a section of mud and debris, the cavers recovered bones later determined to be human. After extracting strands of DNA from the sections of skull and jawbone, police compared them to samples taken from Eloy's living relatives, and they were a perfect match. After having been missing for almost a quarter of a century, Eloy Campillo Perez had finally been found. When news of the match reached Eloy's 75-year-old daughter, Mercedes, she defied her advanced years to hike all the way out to her father's final resting place to pay her last respects. Her loved ones implored her to await further developments at home, but Mercedes insisted on camping near the cave system's entrance while the subsequent investigations unfolded. She was present when investigators determined that Eloy had been executed by a single shot from a 9mm Astra 400 handgun, the same variety of pistol found in Juan Fernandez Ayala's possession following his sudden and violent death. Throughout the remainder of 2018 summer, Spanish authorities continued to reconstruct Eloy's skeleton, and it was through this process that they made a chilling discovery. Eloy's weren't the only set of human remains that had been left down to rot there in the dark. As investigators began working to reconstruct the second of the two skeletons, several details became evident. The first was that the bones belonged to a female, aged 10 to 14 years old when she'd expired. The second was that the girl hadn't died on the same night as Eloy, but rather between 5 and 15 years later. After analyzing the girl's bones to determine the date of her death, investigators determined that the girl was most probably the child of local shepherds who had accidentally fallen into the cave while working or playing near its entrance. Yet this claim was quickly dismissed by accomplished forensic anthropologist Dr. Fernando Cerullia. Dr. Cerullia was famous in Argentina for having helped identify almost 100 nameless Argentine soldiers who died in their disastrous attempted takeover of the British Falkland Islands. Then, upon hearing of the Cantabrian Jane Doe, she was generous enough to offer her services to the Spanish government. However, upon performing her own analysis of the girl's remains, Dr. Cerullia declared that the girl could not have been a rural shepherd. Her bone structure suggested that rather than a diet consisting mostly of corn, which would have marked her out as coming from a low-income rural family, the girl had subsisted on high amounts of low-fat animal protein, meaning she was probably raised on the much more populous Cantabrian coast. Dr. Cerullia further analyzed the girl's DNA to create a physical depiction of what she might have looked like. She was said to have been around 4 foot 8 inches tall, with green eyes and dark brown hair. This description was then disseminated all over Cantabria, in the hopes that it might jog someone's memory, but sadly, no one came forward with any pertinent information. Perhaps the closest investigators came to a definitive break in the case was after learning of a little-known fact regarding the Picos de Europas. Following General Franco's rise to power, many innocent Spaniards simply disappeared, but not all were victims of the fascist secret police, and not all joined the guerrillas in the mountain refuge. Some wished to go off the grid, so to speak, and live out their lives in privacy among Spain's remote, mine-riddled mountains. Some of these people would have been wanted by Franco's fascists for perceived disloyalties to the regime, while others simply didn't want to live under a dictatorship but couldn't bear to abandon the country of their birth. Most found work as undocumented miners and affiliated mining workers, and built their own ramshackle housing hidden among the pine-blanketed hillsides. Some would marry, others would have children, but all would remain utterly secluded from the world around them. Therefore, it stands to reason that if one of their community went missing, they would do their utmost to avoid the involvement of outside authorities. A police investigation might uncover far more than just the truth, and for many of Spain's Republican fugitives, such a possibility could not be entertained. Given that less than 20% of the girl's skeleton had been recovered, investigators had been unable to determine the exact cause of her death. In fact, some attempts at analysis have preceded some very strange observations. For example, there's no doubt that the girl fell almost directly down the cave's 180-meter-long entrance shaft before smashing into its rocky floor. Yet only a few of the recovered bones show any signs of high-energy impact damage. The girl's femur and jaw were completely intact, with only small sections of her cranium said to display any significant damage. This has led some to theorize that the girl was murdered via a blow to the head, then somehow placed down in the cave in a way which precludes any kind of prolonged fall. Essentially, there are two competing primary theories here. Number one, the girl's death was entirely accidental and by some physical anomaly only fractured her skull after a near 200-meter fall into a hard, rocky surface. Or number two, the girl was murdered by someone with so much twisted affection for her that he chose to gently lower her body into the cave in a sick parody of a funeral. As of June of the year 2022, the identity of the Topanoria Jane Doe remains a mystery, and while Spanish police have stated that investigation is still open, the chances of further developments is highly improbable. Her DNA has since been uploaded to the Phoenix database, a project launched by the Civil Guard in 1999 to help solve cold cases, as well as to identify John and Jane Does. Eloy Campillo's remains were eventually returned to his family, and he was laid to rest in the ancient cemetery of the very town he'd given his life to protect. His daughter stated that the Topanoria Jane Doe is also buried in that same cemetery right next to her father's grave. After they'd been so many years down there together in the cave, she said, it wouldn't be fair to separate them now. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. EST, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays, Tuesdays, and Thursday nights. I'd love to see you there. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/letsreadofficial, or send it over email, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, all you need is a baba, a gucker, and a tablet.